Hello, and thank you for joining me for this Cabot Institute Oceans Seminar. My name's Paul Merchant. I'm a lecturer in Latin American film and visual culture in the School of Modern Languages at the University of Bristol. And I'm also one of the incoming co-directors of Bristol's Centre for Environmental Humanities. I'm really delighted to be part of this seminar series. As a researcher whose background is very much in the arts and humanities, it's wonderful to be part of a truly interdisciplinary group of researchers who share an interest in understanding and protecting our environment. Today, I'm going to talk about how artists from Chile and Peru are responding to environmental challenges on those countries' Pacific coasts, and how those creative responses might help us to live well in changing coastal environments across the world. The research I'm carrying out on this topic forms part of a project that has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and I'm very grateful for their support. The way the seminar will be structured is that I'm going to talk for about half an hour, so there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion before we finish at 6:30. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, please do submit your questions and your comments at any time via the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Angus is on hand to collate your questions for the discussion afterwards. And this session is being recorded, so it'll be available afterwards if you want to pass it on and share that. It'll be available on the Cabot Institute's YouTube channel in due course. So what I want to cover in today's seminar, I'll say a little bit about why I've decided to focus on the Pacific, why Chile and Peru, the challenges that the region is facing, the environmental challenges that the region is facing. I'll give some examples of how artists are responding to those challenges and what I think is really significant and exciting about their responses. And although I'm only a few months into what is an 18-month project, I'll risk a few very tentative conclusions. So you'll forgive me in advance for the tentative nature of those. So to start with the why question, why do this project? Why does this topic matter? Well, I think we know instinctively that how we represent and communicate environmental problems can make a huge difference to the response that a spectator or a listener or a reader might have. Just think of the images from Blue Planet 2, the BBC documentary series of plastic pollution in the oceans, and the response that they generated from the public and from government around that issue. You wouldn't get the same impact from a graph or from a table of figures. And this question of representation is crucial because issues like climate change, rising sea levels, or the depletion of marine biodiversity are what Timothy Morton calls hyper-objects. And to quote Morton, they are things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans, things that are very hard to directly grasp or visualize. How could you make a picture of climate change, for example? But these issues nonetheless have profound impacts on our lives and on the world. And it's striking in the book that Morton wrote about hyperobjects, he used an iceberg on the cover. And I think you could argue that the ocean itself is one such hyperobject, impossible for us to apprehend in its totality. In the words of Steve Mentz, a literary scholar, it is, to quote him, the biggest object in the world. And this is why my working hypothesis, if you like, is that art that engages with the ocean and with its associated ecological processes is pushed to find new ways of letting the spectator see or feel or sometimes interact with its subject matter. In other words, when writers and filmmakers and artists think with the ocean, or they make the ocean somehow the medium that they work with, they incorporate it into the artwork, they are finding new forms of expression, and these new forms in turn affect us as readers or spectators or sometimes as participants. So the works that I'm going to talk about are often multi-sensory. They engage several of our senses at once, and immersive. They surround us either metaphorically or literally sometimes, engaging us on several fronts and often going beyond a single screen or page. So that's the starting point, which provides the foundation for my project's research questions. And these are sort of the formal objectives, if you like, of the project. Thinking about how responses to the ocean reveal neglected local histories and contemporary social and ecological challenges. How do these artworks circulate? To what extent are they part of a broader social conversation locally, nationally, and internationally across national boundaries? And how can we as scholars work with artists and other groups to produce critical work and other kinds of knowledge that furthers public understanding of how we can live well in changing coastal environments? I want to dwell for a moment or two on the local histories that are mentioned in the first of my research questions there. And I should note at this point that I'm very far from the only humanities scholar to be interested in the oceans. Those of you who attended the Cabot Oceans seminar in February, given by Lawrence Publicover from the English department at Bristol, along with Kate Hendry, will know this. There are plenty of us at Bristol in the humanities who are interested in the sea in one way or another. And indeed, within the new-ish field of the environmental humanities, there are the blue humanities, studies of literature or history or media that put the ocean at the center. I've given you just a few examples of some of the books in this field. They often have very beautiful covers, as you can see. There is really wonderful work in this area, and I'm lucky to be able to build on it. But much of it, not all, but much, is still Anglophone and is focused on the Atlantic or on the global north. South America hasn't yet had much of a look into these discussions, and I think, unsurprisingly, that it should, for a number of reasons. First, because expanding the scope of the blue humanities to include South America makes the field better able to address the global nature of the ecological challenges it tackles. Not least because Chile and Peru have been identified as two of the countries that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and are countries where the often destructive or irresponsible extraction of natural resources forms a significant part of their economies. So you might have heard the term extractivism or an extractivist policies to describe the economic structures of these countries. It's a term that's used a lot by activist groups, by academics, by NGOs. I think we should also pay attention to what's going on in Chile and Peru, because there has been a remarkable burst of creativity in recent years around environmental issues, especially, but not only, in the visual arts. It's the visual arts I'm going to be talking about mostly today. Now, the emergence of multisensory, immersive art about the ocean from an ecological perspective in Chile and Peru is in one sense surprising. For decades, and especially since the War of the Pacific that was fought between the two countries between 1879 and 1883, with Bolivia fighting on the side of Peru against Chile as well, representations of the ocean in what we might term mainstream culture, some of the most visible representations of the ocean, have focused on military battles from the war, the gain or loss of territory. Some of Chile's and Peru's most renowned national heroes, whose busts and statues adorn towns and cities across the two countries, are men, and they are always men, in fact, are men who took part in the War of the Pacific. So on the left there, you have one example, the Peruvian Admiral Miguel Grau, and the very large monument to him in the center of Lima. More recently, during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, the Pacific Ocean took on a different, darker meaning as the bodies of those who were disappeared, abducted, tortured, and murdered by the regime were tied to rails, as in metal rails from railways, and thrown from helicopters into the water. Now, the image you see on the right is a rather disturbing reconstruction of this from a documentary about the sea in Chile called The Pearl Button from 2015. So an approach to the ocean which is not only about conquest or territory or even about the memory of horrific political violence, but which seeks to understand it as also an ecosystem, an assemblage of living things and non-living elements into which we as humans are inextricably bound, feels like something of a departure. And this is one of the reasons that my project is titled Reimagining the Pacific. It's a change in cultural perceptions that appears to be underway. But, and this is a very important qualification, this view of the ocean, this idea that the ecological sensitivity in art is a big change, is a big departure, that is only really valid from a certain perspective, and from a perspective that excludes, an all too frequent perspective, that excludes the experiences and histories of the region's indigenous peoples. As we'll see shortly, recent artworks, art projects, interventions are acknowledging that for many communities, the relationship with the ocean has long been one of reciprocity and exchange, rather than one in which the humans simply decide what use they want to make of the ocean and its life. Before I move to talk to you about some of the artists doing this work, though, I think it's probably sensible to give you a brief sketch of some of the ecological challenges that they're responding to, some of the challenges that the Pacific regions of Chile and Peru are facing. So this is very much a sketch, as you can see. I'll start talking about fishing, because I think this is something that I hadn't really foreseen when I designed the project, quite how prominent it was going to be. But this is a very significant issue in the region. Peru has the world's third largest fishery after China and Indonesia, and this fact has not gone unnoticed by those who would seek to profit from this natural resource. You might have seen back in the autumn of 2020 a report on Channel 4 News on the increased activity of Chinese fishing fleets in what should be legally protected conservation areas off the Peruvian coast. And in fact, The Economist, the British newspaper, The Economist, reported a couple of weeks ago on a row in Peru over a proposal to protect stocks of a fish called anchoveta. And these stocks are themselves threatened by climate change. In Chile, meanwhile, one of the issues that attracts most attention from environmental NGOs is intensive salmon farming in the south, in the waters off Patagonia. And fishing in Chile accounts for about 0.5% of GDP, so it's a substantial part of the economy. Intensive salmon farming can lead to a drastic reduction in biodiversity, in part because of the transmission of harmful parasites, and it can lead to antibiotic resistance because of the intensive use of antibiotics in the farms. So there's really significant implications for the health, not just potentially of marine ecosystems, but human health, health of other parts of the global ecosystem. And climate change, I mentioned that it might have impacts on fish stocks through rising sea temperatures. As we all know, it also is leading to an increase in extreme weather. So a key example of this in this region would be the El Nino phenomenon, which is changing in response to climate change. And some of the artworks that I'm going to talk about in a bit respond to that. An issue I've already mentioned is that of plastic pollution in the oceans. Like the rest of the world, there is a movement in Chile and Peru trying to combat this. And in fact, the postdoctoral research associate on this project, Dr. Rebecca Irons, her research is really focusing on this issue, looking at campaigns against ocean plastic pollution in Peru. And these campaigns draw heavily on the importance of seafood to Peru's national brand. You've probably noticed how Peruvian gastronomy has had this vastly increased visibility in recent years. You may not be familiar with the next term, sacrifice zones. This is a term that was actually first used in the United States in the 1970s to refer to the long-term effects of mining in the west of the country. It refers to zones that are used as an outlet for concentrated pollution and ecological destruction. Unsurprisingly, perhaps these are often located near poorer or marginalized communities. Although it originated in the US, it has acquired considerable currency in contemporary Chile and Peru, where it's used by NGOs and activists to describe locations like Quintero Puchuncaví, which you can see in the image on the slide there, which is infamous for the quantities of pollutants, including sulfur dioxide, that it releases into the air and the ocean on that site. And as you can see just on the edge of that image, is right next to a residential community. The effects of mining and water rights, in fact, that penultimate one should probably say. The water rights is an especially live issue in Chile, where the current constitution implemented in 1980 under Pinochet privatized these rights so that they could be freely traded with very few restrictions and minimal state regulation. So in a sense, I'm moving away from the ocean here to talk about rivers and bodies of fresh water, but that approach is replicated in the setup of fishing rights, where unfettered free market leads to the dominance of a few big corporations. And as we'll see in a moment, looking at some of the artworks, a lot of these artists are thinking holistically about the water cycle, about from glaciers up in the Andes right down to the ocean, and about the preservation of water from the mountains right down to the ocean. So it doesn't really make sense to think of the cycle in separate parts necessarily. Now, the last of these and all of the above factors that I've just mentioned contribute to this, which is the weakening and sometimes the loss of local coastal traditions, especially those linked to indigenous groups. Now, this can become something of a vicious circle, as practices associated with these groups, methods of fishing, for example, can provide a starting point for thinking about more sustainable relations with the ocean. There is, though, some hope here. So to give an example from Chile, the 1980 constitution that I just mentioned is on its way out. Just last weekend, so a few days ago, Chile held elections for a constitutional convention, which will draft a new constitution. And one thing that is already different is that indigenous groups have guaranteed seats in this convention, whereas in the 1980 constitution, they had no recognition at all. So The Economist also reported on this issue, funnily enough, a couple of months ago, giving the example of the Chango people, a coastal fishing culture from northern Chile, who had actually been declared extinct by anthropologists, but over 4,000 people identify as Chango, and they now have a seat in the Constitutional Convention. So, having given you very much a bird's eye view, a high-level sketch of some of these issues, I want to move now to talk about some of the artists who are responding to these issues. Often, as I suggested at the start, creating works that are immersive and engage several of our senses at once. Just as the problems that I've outlined can't be entirely separated, they kind of bleed into each other, so the works that I'll discuss resist easy categorization. So often something is a film, but also an installation and also a poem. It takes on various different forms, engages us on several different fronts. And this is certainly true of the work of the first artist I'll talk about, Celia Riconia, who's by far the best known of the figures I'm going to discuss. She's many things. She's a performance artist, she creates installations, she's a poet, she's a filmmaker, and her work often crosses boundaries between those categories. Now, this is the case in Con Con, an hour-long documentary poem, that's what she calls it, a documentary poem, which is created from 12 shorter works and was released in 2010. In this work, Vicuña presents the ocean around the fishing village of Con Con on Chile's central coast as a living being, one that participates in the enactment and the creation of her art, and that is wounded, perhaps mortally, by the massification of industrial trawler fishing in the early 21st century. Perhaps mortally, she talks about la muerte del mar, the death of the sea, is a poetic phrase from an older Chilean poet that she comes back to. One of the principal creative strategies that Vicuña employs in constructing this vision of the ocean as a living being, as an agent, something that has creative agency, centers on her precarios, which are really small, precarious, as the name suggests, land art installations constructed of sticks, shells, bits of driftwood on the beach. She builds them on the beach, and then the waves come and they wash them away. And you see this process in the film. This apparent destruction, though, Vicuña's voiceover informs the spectator of Con Con, is in fact the completion of the work. So what she's saying is that she is co-creating the artwork with the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is coming and completing the work. So the Pacific is endowed with creative agency. And it's also, interestingly, at points in the film, presented as an explicitly feminine being. Vicuña refers to it repeatedly as la mar, whereas in standard Spanish grammatically it would be el mar, masculine. She calls it la mar, which is what the fishermen of the area, the Chino fishermen, that's the name of their culture, refer to it as la mar. She documents the Chino musical and cultural traditions in the area, even as she says they're at the point of disappearing. So she's constructing this final record of their traditions, including their fishing practices. And as you can see in this image, Concon makes frequent use of close-up shots of the meeting point between the human body and the ocean. And I think here, I was talking about how artwork's appealing to our senses. Here, really appealing to our sense of touch. We can almost feel the sticky red dye on Viconia's hands, I think, as we look at this image. These intimate encounters are frequently inscribed with gendered connotations, perhaps most explicitly in this sequence, where Viconia releases red dye into the coastal waters, and then she uses the dye to daub the title of the film on a white card. If we follow this gendered reading, you could see it as a kind of figuration of the seas bleeding, even a kind of menstrual bleeding or a bleeding from a wound engendered by these industrialized fishing practices. But in any case, I think what matters here is that it really is encouraging us to recognize the sea as material, as an object or even a body of some sort on which we have an impact, not just a transparent, unchangeable void, which has so often been the case throughout many different forms of Western culture, actually. And that's a long story and argument that we can talk about later, but there's a long tradition of that. The sea is kind of eternal, timeless, unchanging, something that we can't affect. Viconia's saying it is a body, it is material, we can affect it, we do affect it. Now, Viconia is one of the artists who takes a holistic approach to the water cycle that I was mentioning earlier. This is her installation Quipu Menstrual, so this idea of menstrual bleeding again, which she created in 2006 to protest the impact of a mining project on glaciers in Chile. The idea that the impact on glaciers is going to reduce the flow of water into the rivers and damages the water cycle as a whole. I won't go into too much detail on this for now. We can perhaps talk about it in the discussion, but she, as is often the case in her work, she's drawing on indigenous practices, the quipu from Andean culture, from Inca culture, and on weaving as a way of suggesting an intimate connection between human culture and the natural environment. So that getting beyond a division between nature and culture and using indigenous practices to do this is really at the heart of Viconia's work. The way that she does it is she mixes all sorts of different indigenous cultures, though, from the Chino fishermen to Quechua and Inca culture to the Mapuche. And it's really more about a kind of bodily engagement with the ocean and a kind of performance rather than a really deep engagement with specific indigenous culture when she's thinking about the ocean. The approach taken by Ana Teresa Barbosa and Rafael Freire in their 2019 installation Ecosistema del Agua, so ecosystem of water, is quite different. This is much more specific, a more specific investigation. This installation was first exhibited in Lima at the Contemporary Art Museum in 2019 and is going to be shown again at the Sydney Biennale in 2022. Ecosistema del Agua draws on the knowledge of societies that have inhabited the Peruvian desert, which is a coastal environment. It's right next to the ocean, over centuries. And they've been obliged to establish a relationship with water precisely because of its scarcity. And they develop technologies, and the recognition of indigenous practices technology is crucial here to manage water so they could inhabit these arid spaces. So they develop systems of irrigation, capture and purification of water, and these are using plants, reed plants, totora plants, and they use them to make utensils and furniture and irrigation channels. So Freire and Barbosa worked with artisans from these communities to design the installation, and it won a prize for art and innovation in 2019. And I think it's really interesting that these ancient practices that are brought right up into the modern day are given a prize for innovation. I think I'll come back to that later at the end. I think that's a really kind of crucial shift in perspective. So the project, Ecosistema del Agua, is an installation designed for the visitor to recognize the system and its processes, the tilancias, which capture the humidity of foggy areas and capture the water from that humid mist that you get in the desert in Peru. So it integrates natural elements with ancestral technologies of water management. And as you can see here, it's very much a participatory experience. You get wet. And in the far corner there, you can sort of experiment with some of the different water management technologies, the different uses of plants to manage drainage and irrigation and water capture. You can lie down on the mat like that kid's doing there. You can feel it and touch it. You're engaged on all sorts of different sensory fronts. And I think I'll move on to my last example in a moment, but I just want to stress this idea of the forward-looking nature of this project, that it's taking ancient practices and saying this is something that we can think about as we consider water management in the future. And this is also an ecosystem that is profoundly linked to the ocean, because the mist, the garua that these plants capture that go across the Peruvian desert is generated by cold currents, by the Humboldt Current in the Pacific Ocean off Peru. Okay, so I'm going to move to my final examples. I'm returning to Chile here. And this is a work by Fernando Godoy and the collective called Tsunami Arte Sonoro. Tsunami, you might see the unusual spelling there. So taking tsunami and taking the idea of sound, incorporating it into the word. So Fernando Godoy works a lot with sound art, and Archipelago, Archipelago is in many ways a sound art project, although it's more than that. This was a project that Fernando Godoy undertook with two others, Esteban Agustin and Carlos Lertora, in 2018. And he undertook it in response to a rather disturbing phenomenon in 2016, which was known as the Marea Roja, the red tide. And this is an algal bloom that's quite common in southern Chile, but this was a particularly bad instance of it. This algal bloom turns the seawater red and makes seafood toxic. So the extent of this outbreak was unprecedented. And it's not clear, actually, I did a bit of rooting around in some scientific papers and in the report of a commission established to investigate it. It's not clear what caused it, possibly El Niño, so potential climate change impacts there, or possibly the dumping of 4,700 tons of dead salmon from the salmon farms that may have contributed to the intensity of this particular algal bloom that had a devastating impact on biodiversity in the region, and obviously had a big impact on fishing communities around Chiloé, which is an island right in the south of Chile. So Fernando Godoy was interested in exploring the consequences of what he thinks of as extractivism, the intense extraction of natural resources from the sea, and how sound might help us think about this differently or feel it more in a more bodily way perhaps. And he was fascinated by how little we know about the sounds of the sea, how alien that is to us. So he wanted to explore that underwater soundscape, create a sonic record of it, and think about the kind of sonic impact that we're having in that area. So he and his two teammates, they undertook 3 journeys on the boat that you can see there of 4 to 10 days each. And they lived on the boat, which they also thought of as a kind of laboratory. They used instruments to capture sound. They used a set of hydrophones to capture sounds, and also then broadcast it over the internet on a site that they have called Radio Tsunami. And they found at first that they were a bit disappointed, I think, because they thought, it's quite homogeneous. It was difficult to capture sounds that animals were using to communicate. They noticed some clicking from shrimp. But then when they went near the salmon fisheries, they found a constant kind of machine-like hum, very clear evidence of human impact there. But as they progressed with the project, their idea of what the project should be changed. They became more and more interested in the cultural landscapes of the islands, in the stories of the fishing communities. And they realized that they really needed to focus on this more in the 3rd voyage. They recorded the stories of those who'd worked at sea to incorporate them alongside these soundscapes. Often these were older people whose knowledge of certain kinds of fishing practices was at risk of disappearing. So again, this imperative to record what is being lost is very strong. And they're reflected on their own practice, on their own relationship as outsiders coming in, how they related to the local community. And instead of just participating to the world beyond the community via the internet, they transmitted via FM radio to local radio stations. And this is another work that exists in many, many different formats and is still growing. There's a documentary film, there was an installation in a local contemporary art museum, and there's a book on the way with a cassette to listen to some of the sound art that they produced. And I find this project really intriguing and inspiring, actually, because it engages listeners with the ocean and our impact on it in a new and really arresting way, how it puts human stories and sounds on a level playing field, if you like, with the underwater soundscapes, thinks about how those coexist. And I admire their willingness to change their approach and to engage with the local community as a key part of their practice. And Fernando Godoy has a fantastic, really fascinating idea, a word to describe the sea. So instead of territory that is just conquerable or to be dominated or used by humans, he coined the term maritorio, so which is a way of saying kind of, there's no easy way of saying that in English, but he's replacing the land with the sea. And just it's a way of acknowledging how different a space that is, and how we relate to it differently. We should relate to it differently. So as I move towards a conclusion, I think it's worth mentioning that, just highlighting that project, Archipelago, like the others that I've mentioned, hinges on various kinds of collaboration between the three artists and with the local communities. And in the case of Ecosistema del Agua, the collaboration of the visitors to the installation is a central part of the work itself, as is the artists' collaboration with artisans. And in Vicuñas Precarios, the ocean itself is a kind of collaborator, completing those installations by destroying them. And just as these works encourage us to pay more attention to the relations between humans and the environment, often the marine environment, and to think of those relationships as a kind of collaboration, and kind of codependence, if you like, founded on reciprocity and mutual care. So these projects also model a more collaborative and relational approach to artistic creation. It's not the case that one artist is dictating, it sort of comes out of the artist's head and is created at his or her command. It's a much more relational process. By the same token, I think these works demand a more collaborative approach to their study and analysis. And one of the joys for me of this project so far has been the way it's been pushing me beyond what you might call the old model of the humanities scholar who reads some books or looks at some pictures or watches some films, thinks about them, and then writes down his or her thoughts. Now, to be clear, I still do a fair bit of that. But I also talk to the artists, I'm holding workshops with them, and I'm working as part of a team of brilliant scholars from different disciplines. So I'm keen to think about knowledge production as a collaborative endeavor, just as the artists are keen to think in the same way. So I mentioned the postdoc, Rebecca Irons, who's a medical anthropologist, so from a very different background to me, who's looking at the representation and communication around plastic pollution in Peru. These campaigns are often focused on the potential effects on human health. I don't want plastic in my ceviche, right? In my seafood. But what about animal health? This is the question that Rebecca is asking, and that some of the artists that she's looking at are asking too. This sculpture by Chavela Noriega, an intervention on a Lima beach of a dead fish. It's called the suicidal fish that's jumped out of the ocean because it can't bear to live there anymore because the pollution really begs that question. It unsettles us with that question. And then I've got the privilege of working with a brilliant research master's student on the Cabot Institute's research master's program in global environmental challenges. And that whole program is about interdisciplinary working to tackle these environmental challenges. And Lois is researching the uses of art in environmental campaigns in Chile. And so is looking particularly at how artworks circulate both in physical spaces and online. And there's one example of this on the right there, the artistic collective Delight Lab, who make a very frequent use of projections. And here they're projecting the term zona de sacrificio, sacrifice zone, onto the Quintero Puchuncaví area. There, the smoke, the pollution itself becomes a medium, right? I talked about the ocean becoming an artistic medium. Here, the pollution itself is being co-opted as an artistic medium, is what is being projected on. Now, there's lots more to do here. I haven't thought in that much detail yet about artistic collaborations with natural scientists. There's a lot of exciting work going on in that area, and scholarship, increasingly scholarship in that area too. The Chilean artist Claudia Müller has worked with glaciologists, for example, to understand glacier retreat. So that's an area I want to develop in the future. But if I move now to some very tentative conclusions, where does all this leave me in terms of the research questions that I outlined at the start? Well, you'll have to forgive me for saying that I haven't got definitive answers yet. But to return to the overarching question of how these works might help us to live well in changing coastal environments, not just in Chile and Peru, but elsewhere too, why it's worth thinking about them. I think what we can say is that contemporary artists in Chile and Peru are clearly reimagining the Pacific Ocean beyond a flat, empty territory which is fought over, or as a site of disappearance and political trauma, or as a site for resource extraction. Making art with and about the ocean allows the artists to use it as a space for reimagining other things. I actually think that the ocean has long been a space for imagining alternative futures in Chile and Peru. And that's a long argument and story that we don't have time to get into now, but we can certainly see it happening in contemporary art. So it becomes a space for imagining alternative futures. And I think that this is happening in two principal ways. I think that this work is allowing us to reimagine what counts as technology, so valuing artisanal practices and local knowledge as kinds of technology, rather than simply betting, and there's lots of discussion about this, isn't there, in terms of the climate crisis, rather than simply betting on expensive, large-scale technological solutions to get us out of the ecological crisis. Thinking about local, ancient, long-standing technologies that have allowed adaptation and resilience to climatic change, and working with the knowledge we've already got, not letting it disappear. And the kind of work that allows us to do this, the way that these artists are often working with communities, actually makes us stop and reimagine what counts as community, expanding it to include non-human life forms in a relationship of interdependence and reciprocity, but also within human communities. So better recognition for indigenous knowledge that I already mentioned, collaboration between artists and local groups, between artists and the spectators or the visitors or the participants in their works too. So why does this matter? Well, I think because what we now call the Pacific Ocean, what the Spanish once called the Mar del Sur, the Southern Sea, is in fact just one area. You can't divide up the ocean. That is just one area of the world ocean, of the largest object in the world, the body of water that covers over 70% of our planet's surface and on which we all depend. So local challenges and local histories, if they have to do with the ocean, they are never just local. And if there are new effective ways, or even old effective ways being brought to light that make us more aware of challenges and give us new resources for dealing with ecological challenges and make us more aware of possible futures that face us, then wherever they come from, I think we should probably pay attention. I will leave it there for now. I'm looking forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you very much for listening. Oh yes, I meant to mention at the start actually, but you can see on the slide there that I have a blog for the project Reimagining the Pacific. So do have a look at that, and that gives some account of our activities so far, and some blog posts about our research by myself and by Rebecca. Yeah, thank you very much everyone for listening and for your questions. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too, and I hope you have a lovely evening.